Okay, welcome everyone for this week's Pulsus Research Seminar Series, and this is one of the forums in which we bring together the best research from within the school and also eminent researchers from outside the school to showcase innovative and interesting work. And it's terrific today that we can welcome Dr. David Duriesmith, who's our latest UQ Development Fellow in the school. We have three fellows in the school, and David's the newest arrival. David's work is in critical security studies. He works on masculinities. He's doing a project at the moment on, I've got to get the word, the concept of good men and good masculinities within the international sphere. I think we could do with a few more of those. And David's first book came out last year, or this year, depending, I believe. Yep. Routledge have double badged it, and it's called Masculinity and New War. So it's terrific to have David here to talk to us today. So I'll hand it over to you.
So my paper today is Militarised Masculinities Beyond Methodological Nationalism, charting the multiple masculinities of an Indonesian jihadi. But before I jump into the paper, I just want to give you a bit of context about it. So it's co-written with me and Nahuda Ismail from the Institute for International Peacebuilding in Jakarta. And this paper really came about because we had a bit of a fight. We had a fight during fieldwork about how to refer to a bunch of foreign fighters and former terrorists that we were working with. And the project was really about how does a man leave a foreign fighter network and what kind of masculinity does someone have when they get out. But what we couldn't agree on is who these people were. For Huda, when he looked at these people, he said, these are a group of Indonesian jihadis. That's their primary identity. For me, I totally disagreed with him on that point and said, no, actually, when I look at them, I look at Javanese, Betawi, Balinese, different ethnic groups of jihadis in the Indonesian networks that have totally different gendered experiences on the basis of their positionality and class, race, etc. So this paper is going to explore the complex overlapping hierarchies of gender that are present in contemporary conflict. We're going to be making the case to you that the understandings of gender and war, which take the nation state as the analytic starting point, will fundamentally misunderstand the way in which gender operates in contemporary conflict. This is building on some of my previous work in Masculinity and New War, and what we're proposing is that feminist international relations scholarship needs to resist methodological nationalism in favour of a more intentional approach to locating the best scales for studying gender and power in any given instance. Feminist international relations scholarship, to set a bit of a context here on armed conflict, is increasingly drawing on men and masculinity studies. This is work that's being done in anthropology, sociology, and associated disciplines that tries to understand the importance of gender in creating organised violence, and in particular the importance of gender in structuring men's lives to make them more or less violent. This scholarship has argued that masculinities make war possible. By producing powerful patterns of gendered performance and rewarding certain kinds of violence while punishing others, masculinity makes war a possibility. This literature began looking at militaries in the global north, focusing over the last decade on the global south instead. There is some theoretical diversity within this literature, but the majority of this work is taken on Raewyn Connell's notion of masculinities and the gender order. Connell's approach, which emphasises the multiplicity of masculinities, it's not just that there is one masculinity in society, but there are multiple relating masculinities and femininity, and that these are organised hierarchically in a relatively sedimented gender order. While our research suggests that Connell's theorising on masculinity still has a lot to offer for studying the gendered structure of armed conflict, the fact that it leads to reading gender orders as being necessarily bounded and constrained within the nation state leads work that's using her framework to misunderstand how gender operates at multiple scales and multiple locations in any given time. This work's based on a bunch of life histories with former combatants and former terrorists, as well as a battery of supporting interviews with their partners and people involved in the network. The other main methodological approach that we had was drinking tea, smoking cigarettes, and talking rubbish outside the mosque. I'm not going to go into a lot of that detail, but if you want to ask questions afterwards about the methodological approach of life history research and using biographical approaches, do feel free to hit me up for that. So this paper is about one of these life histories, and I'm going to be telling you the life history of Ali. We interview Ali in a downtown Jakartan mosque. Ali is short, quietly spoken and a well-mannered man in his late stages of life. He's been involved in jihadi networks in Indonesia and beyond for more than 40 years. About a year before our interview, Ali and some of his fellow veterans from the Soviet-Afghan War violently took control of the mosque we were interviewing him in from a bunch of Daesh-supporting jihadis operating in Jakarta. This has now become the kind of capital base for the Afghan alumni who support al-Nusra rather than Daesh in the Middle East. Although Ali is a respected member of the community of foreign fighters, due to a bout of time in prison, he's no longer able to be an active member in the most militant activities of the network. Where Ali begins his life is as a working class Betawi boy in peri-urban Java, just outside Jakarta. The Betawi ethnicity is often referred to as being the local Jakartans, and this is the group of sort of Creole ethnic groups that formed around the capital of Indonesia and are quite distinct from Javanese in their experiences. While Ali is now an experienced jihadi who's fought in Afghanistan, Ambon, and numerous other small conflicts, he began his life in an unremarkable, religiously moderate family. He is the son of a politically inactive tailor who lived outside Jakarta, and his pathway into the network was not facilitated by familial networks with other armed men that we found for other groups that we talked to. Instead, after a relatively stable and largely secular upbringing in a state-sponsored school, Ali describes his life as being dissatisfied as a young child. He says a sense of social exclusion from nation-building processes, and particularly targeted towards the Jakartan elites, made him unhappy with this circumstance. His childhood experiences in the 1960s and 70s were, in the Indonesian context, marked by the overthrow of Sukarno by Suharto and the brutal anti-communist purges organised by the Indonesian military and supported by Islamist political groups. While the crackdown on Darul Islam, this large insurgent group in Indonesia, had largely finished by the time he was born in the early 1960s, the continuing tensions between the multi-religious ideology of Indonesian Pancasila and the enduring influence of Islamic activists shaped the social milieu in which he's raised. It does not seem that the periods of violence and unrest in the 1960s and 1970s directly affected Ali or his family in any intimate way, but he still expressed disillusion with the state-building process. As he reflects back on his life now, he says Suharto's choice to take a secular path after the anti-communist purges was what was troubling him the most, a theme that's going to resonate all through his life. Ali's immediate family were supportive of him, and he was a successful student. Despite this, he wasn't happy with his life. He explains a transformative moment for us when he read a newspaper article on the international oppression of his fellow Muslims about the time that he was 17. Something at this time, he says, as a man, he had to act on. Despite not coming from what the men we speak to refer to as an activist family, activist can mean anything from being involved in charity work to being a foreign fighter, despite not being part of an activist family, he describes the realization that other Muslims are suffering placed a necessary demand on him, which, in his terms, cannot be done by the mouth alone. He had to physically act. This catalytic moment was a key juncture in Ali's life and shifted his life course substantially. His existing perceptions of local Islamic activists fundamentally changed, and his sense of exclusion at the Jakartan elite was crystallised into him joining into this network. After uncovering, in his terms, the international oppression of Muslims, Ali began reading Islamic texts and studying at the local mosque, which encouraged a stricter interpretation of Islam. The new mosque welcomed his enthusiasm, and older men invited him to join a study group that focused on action rather than recitation of texts. During this time, he began to attend a local training college studying mechanical engineering, and although he was very skilled at this role, he didn't have a sense of belonging or satisfaction in the work compared to what he was doing in the mosque. After a year of being involved in the study group, Ali is invited by a senior man to become more active in the network, at first helping to provide aid to the poor and dawah activities, and shortly after by hiding fellow fighters from the government and moving them around the country in clandestine ways. By his early 20s, Ali was called upon by the network to help out the older men evading the government, and he basically gives up his regular life to become a full-time activist, in his terms. This action eventually brought him to the attention of the police, and after he gets attention from the police, he receives an offer from a senior Darul Islam network member to travel to Afghanistan and support his brothers in the fight against the communists. This offer to travel to Afghanistan is a considerable honour in this context. It's not something that is seen as being unwanted, but is actually showing that you are particularly devoted, and is a reward for him having sacrificed his position in the engineering college by looking after these older jihadi men who are on the run from the government. Ali talks about this period in his life as the moment when he really found out what he wanted. The network, Ali explains to us, was a brotherhood where he could work towards something great and have a great feeling of belonging, and that he was helping the global brotherhood rather than just his friends at home. The network supported his travel, and when he arrived in Afghanistan, he describes it as paradise, a theme that comes up with many of the people we spoke with. He explains, "I started to accept Islam as one body, and with the weakness of some Muslims, I need to fill that gap. Because the brotherhood among Muslims is far stronger than blood." This kind of realization has a direct grounding in the religious doctrine in which he's being trained, and sought to link the ideology of a singular Islamic community that he accepts and structures all of his life going forward from this point. The sense of acceptance and purpose is common to the men that we spoke with who went to Afghanistan, and for these men, the fight against the Soviets had been the catalytic moment that put them towards greater involvement in the network and a chance to see action of the real thing. This was a sight of joy and of pleasure. Although Ali's description of this period as ecstatic, his position with the organisation is very far from being privileged. Rather, as a Southeast Asian man with a very modest Islamic education, he was placed in a supporting role, while his Arab and Afghan peers took on active roles in the fighting. As with most of the Indonesian men that went over to Afghanistan, they were largely kept away from the fighting front and instead received training in Arabic language, some basic weapons, and Islamic teaching. He and his peers were not seen as being reliable enough to actually fight in conflicts. Their knowledge of Arabic was poor, and their understanding and practices of Islam was seen as being corrupted with paganism and syncretic religion. This position appears to have been particularly challenging for the Betawi recruits. In comparison to the Javanese who came from Central Java and the traditional seats of authority and status, Betawi were seen as poor, working class, uneducated, secular and corrupt. The collective relegation, however, of all Indonesians and as materially disadvantaged was important for him because it wasn't just his identity ethnically, but that all Southeast Asian men in this fight are lumped together by the Arabs and the Afghans. They're not distinguished by the Arabs and the Afghans, they are by the other Indonesians. Despite this subordinate position, Ali describes this period as where he forms a new identity. He is now Mujahideen, a fighter with a fundamentally different identity. In the network, him and his friends are now known as the Afghan alumni. They've graduated from this period of their life. Within the social context of the Mujahideen training camp, Indonesian Islam is constructed as being uncontrolled and effeminate compared to Afghan or Arab men. In response to his training and disciplining, he's rewarded with a better relationship with Allah, which is proven in his life, he says, by seeing angelic interventions into battle and numerous miracles of fighting. This transformative process shifts him from being an unruly civilian formed by weak masculinity into a hardened, disciplined form of manhood. And that distinction really matters for his life. After training in Afghanistan and seeing some very limited numbers of instances of conflict, Ali returns home as a hero. While far from those involved in the network at home knowing what his actual involvement in conflict was, next to nothing, he's brought back as home as a successful fighter, someone who's driven out the Soviets and defeated the greatest power in the world in the way that they understand it. When he returns home, he says it's with the intention of changing the Indonesian government to fit the paradise of Islam that he experienced in Afghanistan. He explains, God already gave us independence, but we chose to take secular rules rather than God's rules. Of course, when I came back to Indonesia, I had a desire to change that. Well, his desire to change is directly in response to the situation of him as a mujahideen at the time that he left Afghanistan. At the time that he comes back, the Indonesian government has recently stopped a series of brutal crackdowns on violent jihadi groups, which these men see as a betrayal of their support for the anti-communist purges. By the time he returns, the political climate has shifted substantially and there is more space for violent Islamist groups to exist in public life without persecution. His return coincides with the split of Jamaat Islamiyah from the previous Darul Islam affiliated networks due to ideological differences on how Salafi these men should be. From early 1990s until 1999, Ali supports the network but more or less lives a regular life. He financially supports it but doesn't actually get involved in much direct conflict. However, in 1999, after a number of violent outbreaks in the Ambon region, Ali and a group of his friends take over a charity organisation called Kompak. This charity organisation was previously an Islamic charity providing arms to the poor and support to people in marginalised areas. They literally violently take the organisation over and use it as a front to escalate the civil war in Ambon. The Afghan alumni, Ali in particular, are hugely involved in escalating the Ambon conflict from a small ethnic struggle to a massive massacre. While in Ambon, Ali is very directly involved in fighting and becomes a significant player in the organisation of the network. From 1999 till 2003, when Ali returned in Jakarta, the situation of the network had changed rapidly. First, the continuing impact of the fall of Suharto in 1998 and the Reformasi period mean that political Islam is taking a more public role in public life. More importantly, though, the 2002 Bali bombings mean that the members of Kompak become under intense police scrutiny for their long-standing affiliations with Jamaat Islamiyah. A number of the men that we spoke to were directly involved in the Bali bombings as well. These connections have a paradoxical impact on the politics of the movement, as the impact of political Islam becomes more pronounced in society, whereas their particular branch is suffering more persecution. When he returns home to Jakarta, he's quickly arrested. Ali was charged with conspiracy to assassinate a number of police officers through poisoning as part of a jailbreaking attempt. He does not deny that he was involved in the collecting of weapons for the network and other activities, but he says he wasn't involved in that context. From the other men that we've spoken to, we know for sure that there was a very strong pressure on men like him to break these people out of prison, but whether he was actually planning to kill these police officers, we can't say. He's sentenced to 4.5 years in jail on the charge of planning the attack, and this imprisonment shakes some of his previous convictions. In particular, he begins to rethink the idea of fighting in Indonesia itself. He says, the importance of older fighters needs to become more prominent in the network. You must keep the spirit of jihad, but you have to keep the rules of the game. And he's referring here in particular to the Bali bombings, which he thinks haven't kept the rules of the game and have become too violent in that period. This commentary of loss of rules and discipline is both directed towards the terrorists' attacks in Indonesia and to the current construction of violence by Daesh, something that he constantly talks about as being negative. He does not like the Islamic State. He frames these groups as having ruined the reputation of Islam, which in his theological construct is a hugely important claim to make about someone else. It's a death offence. There is a sense from Ali and the peers that we interviewed that the actions of Daesh have tarred them by association and that they've lost the status that they got from being mujahideen, and that this generation has a better kind of masculinity that is more self-controlled and contained in comparison to Daesh, who are seen as wild and barbaric. Some colonial tropes happening here. Since being imprisoned, the role in the network has changed. He's now in his 50s. He serves as a senior statesman. Although he's economically not well off and financially struggles, he's highly regarded by fellow jihadis and the Afghan alumni on the whole. Despite the effect he's afforded, he insists that all foreign fighters are equal within the network. This is something people have told us over and over again. He says, we are all brothers. Over and over again he says that, even though he then goes very rapidly to explain how some men are too weak to take up the spirit to fight, and he has to fill the gap that they've left. Now he's still involved in supporting violence, although he's not actively involved in violent activities. The biggest goal he's trying to do right now is to make sure that his 3 sons go to the Middle East and die fighting. He explains this to me, which I was pretty shocked to hear when he first mentioned it, that this is the greatest goal in his life, because if they die fighting the Ummah, they will be proven as real men. This not only validates his sons as a hero, but justifies his own current inaction, because he is doing something to contribute to the cause. He narrates this to us on one occasion. I said to my son, who's 17, he came to me and he said, "What group should I join?" He said, "Any group you can join, but you have to fight until the end of your life." He's made it very clear that his kids are not allowed to return home once they leave the country. Men like Ali are essential to the practice of war. He served as a foreign fighter, a local leader, an instigator of civil conflict in Ambon, an economic supporter, and occasionally a terrorist. In each of these roles, it's very clear that his participation is motivated by his desire to be a good man, to protect his brothers, and for God, and the reputation of God, and to adopt the mantle of a hero in his community. His original recruitment into the network he describes as being directly motivated by his desire to live up to the expectations of a man. And while in Afghanistan, he describes his transformation as being largely about the transformation of him from an unruly young man to a disciplined senior fighter. This is an important narrative to remember. After the war with the Soviets, he said his metamorphosis was immediate. "We automatically have discipline," he says to me multiple times. The status of a disciplined veteran of the Afghan war equips him with authority to lead other men when violence breaks out in Ambon, and the fact that he had obtained spiritual experience as a fighter provides him with the distinct spiritual qualities that make him charismatic and a respected peer. In his eyes, following the example of 14th century Islamic theologian Ibn Taymiyyah, and the more recent model set up by Sayyid Qutb, volunteering to jihad secures his status as a proven Muslim man, much more so than other signs of piety such as pilgrimage to Mecca. Having transformed by war into a true Muslim man, Ali and his peers can guide their wayward brothers in Ambon into conducting violence in accordance with the right rules. This is a process of instruction that he describes as a game. Jihadis like him have set the rules, and if others follow them, the game won't go wrong. At each of the stages of his life in the network, his gender as a man and his position in relation to other men are of most importance. Women, and this really matters, are conspicuously absent from much of the former foreign fighters' discussions about their activities and lives. Their lives are surrounded by women, but they do not speak of them as mattering. Based on what we know from the other context, there were few women who had the opportunity to talk about their exclusion with the foreign fighters, but the network of foreign fighters doesn't really recognise them as being part of it. They are not really part of the Brotherhood. When prompted directly by Ali, he has some comments about the role of women, that they shouldn't try and go beyond the talents that God gave them, but he says that his role is mostly defined against other men. His role as a man is about how he's positioned to other men, not to women. All women are out of the picture, they don't matter. Rather than speaking about women throughout his interviews, Ali explains to us that his role is about not being like other failed men. He draws on tropes of failed masculinity and weak men to justify his actions at every single stage. The irreligious man, the undisciplined jihadi, the ignorant boy, the oppressive Westerner, the syncretic Southeast Asian man, the overly violent Arab, the victimized local. These tropes rely on the notions of scale to define his comparisons. In employing these notions, Ali is actively constructing and framing the scale in which his actions should be defined and justified. While his position as a man was constantly measured in relation to other men, the men who he could define his himself in relation to depended on the sense of scale that was most pertinent at any given time. To understand this multiplicity, we need to understand Ali not as occupying one position within a predefined gender order, a hierarchy that's pre-existing, but as occupying different positions within multiple overlapping hierarchies, which depend greatly on the context in which he's exhibited at any given time. So what are the multiple masculinities in Ali's life? The trajectory of events that brought Ali to the little mosque in Jakarta for our interviews is in many ways common with other Indonesian jihadi men in the network. His current position as a senior jihadi is defined by his working class background. For those who participated in armed conflict, it was a chance to adopt a warrior masculinity that was respected by their peers, even if you're born as a poor Betawi boy with a shit education. Within the broader Indonesian context, Ali's ethnic background means inheriting a powerful tradition of local Betawi strongmen, the Jago, which have often been affiliated with notions of anti-Dutch resistance. This notion is connected to Betawi identity as local Jakartans and a sense of marginalisation by Javanese and by Chinese elites. In addition to these dynamic factors, such as traditional martial arts, Silat Betawi, or actions of Islamic faith, position him uniquely as compared to the Javanese jihadis, who are primarily based in Central Java, Solo and Yogyakarta in particular. These all structure Ali's masculinity in particular ways. The tradition of the Javanese warrior, as shown by Nyland et al., is deeply entwined with the cultural vernacular of contemporary Indonesia. Even for most men who do not choose to fight actively, the notion of a heroic warrior remains a powerful narrative that shapes the everyday masculinity of men in Indonesian society and plays an important role in the national history of opposition to the Dutch. The notion of being an Islamic warrior and a Jago is deeply connected to Ali's particular Betawi identity in this context. The founder of Jakarta in local understandings is Sultan Fatala, who is known to wage jihad against the Dutch. Here we can see a historical connection to colonial era oppression, to the present day narratives that jihadis use in opposing the other as a foreign occupier. The other in this context could either be Javanese, Chinese, or someone from the West. In this case, the adoption of a Jago identity by Ali positions him within a particular vernacular of masculinity that predates Indonesia as a discrete entity. As a Betawi man, a particular set of understandings and expectations about his identity and role in the movement separate him from the Javanese. While the Javanese tradition had emphasised the notion of a warrior scholar, for the Betawi men, the idea was that you should be a man of action and not so focused on piety. They're less prone to pious contemplation and more prone to action. This seemed to be something of a division of labour within the network. Javanese men, particularly those ones from Yogyakarta, are tied to the sophisticated warrior and they tend to take on leadership and guidance roles. Almost all of the leaders are Javanese men from around Solo and Yogyakarta. Other ethnic groups, and particularly Betawi men, are placed on the front end of operations. Due to their position as local Jakartans, Betawi men in the network are put in the most violent front end activities in the capital and cultivate a notion of a Betawi strongman within the network, in contrast to the pious resistance of the Javanese. One of the other Betawi men that we worked with goes by the name of Rambo, and his claim to fame is that he will shoot cops if you pay him. This is an example of how it works out. Javanese man would not do that. This is a point of pride for Ali and his peers, both by gaining formal training in ideology and war, but also by being able to perform an archetype of Betawi masculine hero identity that has deep contextual meaning in that location. Secondly, though, Ali's articulation of military masculinity is materially situated within the broader Indonesian gender order as well. His actions represent a continuation of Darul Islam's attempt to create an Islamic state during the 1950s and embodies a profound tension across Indonesian society between secularism and political Islam. Additionally, his life is characterised by a particular period of economic transformation during the 1990s, which thrust Western business masculinities into new positions of power and traditional configurations of the strong military man, the traditional leader, and the ethnic nationalist into positions of lost dominance. For Ali and many of his peers during the presidency of Suharto, who positioned himself as a Javanese king, perceives this rule as dangerously secular and a necessary point to rebel against. His gender position is structured directly in relation to and in response to the emergence of secular Western elites during his lifetime, and through his adult life reflects a particular Indonesian story of the gender order and the manifestations of masculinity that can exist within that. Outside of the Indonesian context, Ali's position can be understood in relation to global trends about political Islam and the emergence of Salafi ideology as a driving force in the movement. As part of the first generation of Indonesian foreign fighters trained by the Global Jihadi Network in Afghanistan, his gendered experience was constantly defined and positioned in relation to Afghan, Saudi, and Yemeni and other masculinities. When in Afghanistan, his role was constantly defined with the broad category of Southeast Asian man. The roles he were given were feminised because he practiced a less pure form of Islam. While in Afghanistan, he did not experience the same privileges, positions of respect that he does in Indonesia. and as a Southeast Asian man, he is seen as less masculine, less virile, more effeminate. This placed him into less militant roles and being a supporting role in the military. While these tensions between jihadi men are evident throughout Ali's account, there is also a sense in which his participation in Afghanistan produced him as no longer an Indonesian Muslim man at all. Ali and the other foreign fighters spoke often and animatedly about their new position in the global ummah, having fought and been transformed through battle. This perceived transformation is profound. As an Afghan alumni, he is a global citizen and a part of a common community of Muslims who bear the responsibility for defending all co-religionists because they're now a family. This is a theme of transitional brotherhood and active rejection of their national, ethnic and class identifications is one of the most powerful and troubled ones that we saw through the interviews. Later, when he returns to Indonesia, he comes with the status as Mujahideen, someone who had fought against the Soviets and the imperial overreach of the secularized West. This shift meant that for a working class boy with an unremarkable family, he now occupied a position of respect and that was not reflective of his actual experiences of basically not having fought at all, being disregarded by all the men around him. When he went to Ambon, he didn't travel in as an inferior Southeast Asian man. Instead, he was a reformed expert who'd been made into Mujahideen who could lead the locals. This time he wasn't the ethnically subordinate, he was the superior to the local Ambonese, who he himself then constructed as being effeminate, pagan, and insufficiently prone to action the same way as he was. This time he did not fight under the stewardship of Arab and Afghan men, but as an autonomous branch of the international Islamist movement. Now Ali and his peers positively defined their masculinity as more sophisticated and rational compared to the reckless Arabs and Afghans that he now saw as being hyper-masculine, and the under-masculinity of the men in Ambon who he seen as being not prone enough to action. In preliminary interviews with young men returning from Syria, the role of an older man like Ali is also really important in getting them into the network and gravitating them towards that kind of violence. The importance of this man in structuring current conflicts can't be misunderstood. With significant groups fighting in the 2017 battle for Marawi in the southern Philippines and even larger numbers going to Syria, our initial inquiries suggest that men like Ali are a key step in getting young men to go join these conflicts. In this way, all of Ali's different masculine positions during his life continue to play an important role in shaping the political violence that we see now as being local or global, depending on the given moment. Gender orders and methodological nationalism. So let's get to the theoretical part of the paper. Throughout Ali's life, his position as a man shifts dramatically based on the location which he's operating in. Ali's life as a combatant is categorised by a high degree of mobility and transnational connection. The men we spoke to in Java are actively involved in Afghanistan, Ambon, Aceh, southern Philippines, and a huge number of other small conflicts across the Indonesian archipelago. Their lives are dislocated by pressure from authorities, voluntary moves, and often involve travelling every couple of years, large distances to new locations. While they all spoke in deeply gendered terms about their involvement, drawing on a common vernacular of brotherhood, sacrifice, heroism, protection, discipline, and rationalism, their position as men shifts through their life and was fundamentally relational in its construction. It's easy for us to think about masculinity and femininity as being relatively stable tropes about what men and women should be. While this certainly has some salience, and we're not saying it's not true, it's not a sufficient way to understand the multiple forms of gender that are present in a person's life. For this reason, critical masculinity studies has said that masculinity is not just these exaggerated tropes, but simultaneously a place in gender relations, the practices through which men and women engage in that place in gender, and the effects of those practices on the bodily experience, personality, and culture. Within this understanding, there are multiple masculinities and femininities in any given time, and they're primarily defined not by some innate characteristics that masculinity or femininity has, but how they relate to other masculinities and femininities. They give an existence in their relationality with another understanding of gender. The notion of the gender order here is how these are constructed in relation to one another and how power works between them. Connell's approach to the gender order encourages a focus on the interplay between various articulations of gender. And while Connell's original understanding emphasised the relational quality of gender, These positions are primarily defined as being within a national boundary. Her original framing of the nation-state continues to dominate critical studies of men and masculinities and feminist work in IR on the structure of gender. When talking about formal power, Connell emphasised that the state as the formalisation of the gender order into an institution. This understanding has proven extremely valuable in understanding interstate wars and in showing how the international political economy is able to mobilise different racial groups to conduct different work. In contemporary intrastate wars, the boundaries of the state works far less clearly than this, however. In wars where the state is not the primary actor, locating the role of masculinities requires a more nuanced reading of gender that understands the dynamic interplay between formal organisations and different structures of power. The performance of violence in these instances relies on complicated gendered portrayals of the enemy as certain kinds of beings deserving certain kinds of violence, and kinds of gender performances of certain combatants to make those violences possible. These sorts of portrayals and performances were integral to Ali's relationship with violence. He cast Christian men in Ambon as being barbarous savages who needed to be put down, and he understood other senior mujahideen as being his equal and therefore needing to fight alongside him. The kinds of conflict that Ali took part in are difficult to classify, and we can see numerous typologies being used to describe them. While some authors refer to contemporary conflicts as new wars, uncivil wars, postmodern wars, wars of the third kind, fourth generation wars, alongside more specific denominations like asymmetric war, guerrilla war, insurgency, and civil war. Each of these designations draws on differing factors to differentiate the conflict, blurring the boundaries between war and peace, civilian and combatant, between war crimes and main tactics, between insurgent and criminal networks. In all of them, almost without fail, a distinction between the national and the international is key. They're defined in relation to the nation, either as being interstate or internal to the state, and having some relation to the structure of a nation. The kind of blurry connections we see are visible in all the men that we spoke to. Their involvement in community conflicts in Ambon and the Philippines are not just explained by local dynamics, either in their own locale at home or the locale that they went to go and fight. Though they're involved in a global movement, its globalness doesn't fully encapsulate their practice of violence either. The boundaries between their actions as charity workers, robbers, financiers, people smugglers, terrorists, civil warriors, foreign fighters, and global jihadis are far less rigid than competing typologies have tended to suggest in understanding combatants' actions. It is for this reason that we suggest that a methodological nationalist perspective is damaging our understanding of how militarised masculinities structure and are structured by contemporary conflict. By methodological nationalism, we mean the assumption that the nation-state society is the natural social and political form in the modern world. This concept, which originates in the critique of methodological individualism, suggests that much of contemporary social science is unconsciously biased towards viewing phenomena in relation to the nation-state. This bias, scholars who draw on the concept suggest, unintentionally buys into the apparent naturalness or givenness of a world divided into societies along the lines of the nation-state. International relations scholars, particularly feminist international relations scholars, cannot be said to have focused on the nation-state alone. I'm not making that claim. But despite this, the framings that they tend to use instead use terms like international, global, transnational, all implicitly buying into a methodological nationalist framing of what's occurring about what is inter and what is trans and how the nation fits into this picture, or a dichotomous relationship between the global and local. Even approaches which have tried to break out from this global-local distinction, such as those who use the term glocal or hybrid forms, still fail in this. Mary and Jones's explanation here is helpful in understanding the way in which hybrid approaches to gender are inadequate. Scales like local, subnational, national, global are not neutral. They involve particular configurations of actors, resources, and political opportunity structures that always favour some forces and agendas over others. The politics of scale can address the multiplicity of scales present in militants' lives more productively by actively considering the way in which the politics goes into the configuration of their understanding of scale themselves, not just their gender, but where they actually see themselves as being positioned. Rejecting a methodological nationalist perspective, we believe opens up new possibilities to the study of militarised masculinities by avoiding identifying problems as national problems. and instead of asking more difficult questions about the scale in which they occupy. If we took a methodological nationalist approach to Ali's life, it would be easy to automatically frame his life as being one about a national narrative. Here we could talk about the rise of Indonesian Islamism over the second half of the 20th century, the transformation of Darul Islam into Jalamaah Islamiyah, the economic transformations which fundamentally changed the landscape of the world's largest Muslim country. In interviews with Ali and his peers, they would define their position in relation to other men in Indonesia as a whole, often talking about those horrible, secularized Western economic elites in Jakarta. Their narratives of warrior manhood looked back to a previous time in history where brave Islamic warriors fought Dutch colonialists and lamented the way in which national leaders had been corrupted by the West. If we draw the gender order as being contained within Indonesia, then it would be very easy to frame the experiences of men we interviewed as a manifestation of oppositional masculinity in Indonesia, trying to overthrow the hegemony of economic elites in Jakarta. This picture is more complicated when we look at the relationship between men that are actually in the network. As an Afghan alumni, the fighters spoke that they were treated with a degree of respect and reverence inaccessible to any men who weren't involved in defeating the Soviet Union as they understand it. They were perceived as having been part of a religious movement of true Islamic men that had defeated the Russians and led to the downfall of atheistic communism all over Central Asia. However, this narrative is also linked to the purging of communists in the 1960s, anti-Dutch resistance efforts before that. These experiences placed Afghan alumni in a hegemonic position within the group. They're quite powerful in the group itself, and their status as men who are proven is unquestionable, despite the fact that almost none of them had done any fighting or any fighting that really mattered. Within the Afghan conflict context, their experience was far from heroic and certainly not hegemonic. As Indonesians, they were treated with suspicion, performing a corrupt syncretic form of Islam rather than their pure Arab leaders. Their racialized identity as Southeast Asians compared them poorly to Arab and Yemeni men Arab Yemeni men in particular. When the men we spoke with viewed themselves, on the other hand, as being far more sophisticated than the Arab fighters, who they said were uncontrolled and insufficiently nuanced. They didn't do as good poetry, they argued. In this location, the Indonesian foreign fighters' performance of gender could best be understood as a kind of complicit masculinity, one that is not receiving the full benefits that their peer did in a hegemonic relation due to the racialization of them as Southeast Asian. If we again shift our location to Ambon, where Ali and his peers so destructively exacerbated religious tensions, their actions could be understood in an attempt to establish hegemony for political Islam. Despite being within the same national boundary as Indonesia on the whole, Ali and his peers are suddenly hegemonic because they're foreigners. As a Betawi fighter, his peers receive significant racial status compared to local Ambonese, even though, and even when compared to the Arabs who travel to Ambon are seen as being too destructive and not respectful enough of the locals. While the fighters were greatly privileged, their status as hegemonic man in Ambon is much more tenuous as a site of contestation between Muslim and Christian communities. After being imprisoned in Jakarta, Ali is still an integral part to the practice of war, but we can't really say he's a hegemonic man, as someone who is rotting in jail, has almost no money, and his family is destitute. Within Indonesia as a whole, his position is one of symbolic importance, but material weakness. Having been imprisoned for most of his life and being imprisoned for a chunk of his life and fighting for the rest, Ali has little financial resources and is not able to get the other trappings of manhood that we would understand as showing that you're hegemonic in society. These men are important supporters of war in Afghanistan. They're instigators of violence in Ambon and Poso, as well as being key facilitators of struggles in Aceh, Mindanao, and elsewhere. Their complex subject position, which we've attempted to spell out in this paper, represents a crossroad of local experience, national shifts, global forces, which are all at play in militants' life. To understand the way in which their masculinity is constructed, their masculinity needs to be constructed in relation to some other group. That relies on a particular time and a particular location for that reference point to exist. Throughout Ali's life, he traversed through multiple gender orders, which differed his relationship with power and masculinity as he traversed them. When he came out of one gender order into another, he couldn't simply return back to the previous one the same person as when he left. The man who leaves Indonesia is not the man who comes back to it. His presence in Afghanistan fundamentally changes who he is in relation to that community. His experiences were defined by multiple articulations of the local, whether the local was Betawi, Indonesian, Afghan, Ambonese, as well as multiple articulations of the international, Southeast Asian, clashes with the Soviet Union, positions against the West, and an international ummah. In each of these instances entailed not only different narratives of belonging and representation of gender, but also, but the national one is not necessarily even the most important one in understanding his life. Within Indonesia, his actions are easily and correctly framed as part of a national struggle. But if you took a different framing, his experience would be framed entirely differently. The process, his experience of going through Islamic education changes who he is, locally but also nationally. The relations of masculinity are similarly unclear when Ali's life is framed outside of national lines. If we understand him purely as being a Betawi man, someone who is from a working class background, that can explain some dynamics, particularly his relationship with Javanese men, but it doesn't really explain his relationship with Arab men. It doesn't really explain his relationship with the West on the whole. The discourse of connection and commonality that he also put forward about being all brothers and all the same speaks to a fundamentally different relationship along ethnic and class lines within the network. The axes of power across class and ethnic lines were clear in some sets of interviews. Men from marginal ethnic groups and regions in Indonesia were given dangerous, unglamorous work to support the network and often bore the cost of being fighters. But these differences do not matter when they're in Ambon or Poso. Anyone from Java on the whole is seen as being better than an Ambonese. In Afghanistan, all of them are the same as Southeast Asians. These references of masculinity are relational to a particular context and can't be understood purely within a national confine. So to conclude, our research with former jihadis has reiterated the importance of studying gender as one which understands violence relationally. Despite this, we have real difficulty in expressing the multiple, overlapping and often contradictory ways that hierarchies of gender operate. This is a weakness in the existing framework of gender orders. The result of this experience has not been to suggest a better unit of analysis than the nation state. We're not saying there's a better option instead of the nation state, but that for feminist international relations, taking the question of scale as deliberately part of our own mapping of where gender exists and how it exists needs to be an initial step. For our work, this means taking a more considered approach to the scales we use to select, or even remaining more reflexive and unsure about what scales could possibly exist in any given context. What this work does not suggest also is that we should automatically parrot the scales that are articulated by our participants. Our participants very intentionally drew on concepts of scale to justify their own experience, whether that was talking about the international ummah, talking about their experiences as Indonesians against the Dutch, or talking about the Muslim community being oppressed by the West. Their articulations of scale matter politically and reflect power relations within their context as well. Almost all of our participants emphasised equality within the network, while in the next sentence would describe to us all the ways that they weren't equal. Despite this, almost all of them they spoke of racial, class, national and social power dynamics. This can be particularly seen in the status that's given to Arab men in one context and then not in another. For this reason, we suggest adopting what Cynthia Enlow refers to as feminist curiosity towards methodological nationalism within feminist IR. By challenging our default position as the nation state and adopting a more curious, ultimately more intentional approach to the best unit of analysis for exploring masculinities in war, we feel that feminist international relations may be better positioned to uncover the workings of gender in structuring warfare. All of this is not to suggest the abandonment of the state as an object of analysis, but to take a leaf out of our anthropological peers' textbooks and become less disciplined by our discipline's preoccupation with the nation that might gain some richer understandings of how gender operates to make collective violence possible.
Fantastic. Okay, that was fascinating. So I think we'll get lots of questions here. So would somebody like to lead this off? Martin.
Thanks, David. That was really great. I really enjoyed that. Two questions. One,
Yeah.
on the methodological nationalism thing. It seemed to me that you were maybe modulating two things slightly awkwardly. One, meaning a very general critique of methodological nationalist premises, which doesn't then distinguish between attachments to the state and attachments to the nation, which can after all be quite different things. And on the other hand, a kind of dissatisfaction with the literature that hasn't really gotten to grips with that. And on that latter part, I was really not quite convinced, because I'm thinking about all the people who have been writing about long-standing solidarities among masculinized militarists in nationalist movements across, for instance, Europe. Right? It's been going on for decades. This shouldn't be happening. But clearly there's a polity there of people from very different backgrounds that makes a mutual support possible. And this seems to me, there's a lot of being written about that, maybe not explicitly in the masculinities register, but it seems that the whole literature has looked at this from a different angle all along. So I'm just wondering what the target here is. Is it just IR, and it's a bit of a silly discipline, or is it wider than that?
Now that's a
second
yeah,
one,
yeah.
just kind of to jump off that. Just jump off that is the quicker one on questions of why substitute identities for masculinities, partly because I'm thinking of female Peshmerga fighters.
Yeah.
I'm substituting identities for masculinities, and I'm wondering what is the distinguishing feature, because it becomes race at a certain point, right? I mean, why not race, why masculinity? Are the two, of course they're linked, but they're not the same thing. So in other words, as a way of making a difference, what is the value of masculinity in that context? It kind of goes back to this first question as well.
I'll go to that one first, right? I would not understand masculinities as being primarily identities at all. I would understand them as being part of a hierarchy. People's identity is actually very different often to their position in the gender order. Like, you ask lots of men who are materially disadvantaged. The classic example of this, right, is bikers.
Yeah.
Bikers do not have a ton of social power, but their identity of themselves is as the most masculine men in society, the most powerful. But that's because they have a performance of protest masculinity, because they kind of don't have any of the other social recognition based on class and race. With the distinction with race, all genders are raced and all races are gendered. So I would fundamentally resist trying to differentiate them. Like, I don't think you can talk about masculinity outside of race, and I think it's very hard to talk about race outside of gender. I don't think it's a worthwhile project, basically. All masculinities rely on particular articulations of race. You can't talk about masculinity outside of race, I don't think. When it comes to the general literature stuff, it might be different in different literatures, and I'd love to see where that goes. In the gender side, what I've seen is how it's articulated is multiple European states have gender hierarchies at which men are at the top of, and then they collude internationally to support their hegemonic position by forwarding a sort of internationalized hegemonic masculinity. That's more where I see it in the feminist literature, and that's not one that I think is particularly useful. But I'd be totally keen on seeing other articulations of it. And one of the big things I'd love to hear from people is, like, where the hell to submit this thing? It's a bit of a weird paper, right? And I'm not sure what journal would take it, or about how to frame it a bit in a more way that's going to get read by, people that aren't very specifically interested in my weird stuff.
Okay, so Matt.
Australian Journal of Politics and History.
Yeah,
that was a beautiful setup. Thanks for that. That was fantastic. I really enjoyed that, Dave. It's a great project. A couple of questions. One, I suspect we were all thinking at some point, how on earth did you get ethical clearance for this research? That's question one. Question two was kind of...
by sending it to me.
There we go.
By not working at UQ at the time.
The other question I had was kind of, I mean, in some ways it's a bit of a strange angle to view this project through, but I was wondering what implications, if any, what does your analysis tell us, if anything, about the circumstances of radicalisation, for example, or if you're interested in counter-terror strategies, if you're interested in the context in which individuals are willing to engage in violence to support a particular sort of agenda, whatever it is, does your analysis have much, do you think, to say about the ways in which we currently explore things like the counter-radicalisation, for example?
So that's basically what the big project is, right? It's a project on how do you get men to disengage from violence. And the project is actually frames it as disengaging from patriarchy and particular kinds of patriarchy. I think it does have a lot to say, but the answers are kind of like you have to have this contextual knowledge about what things are salient in people's masculinity during, not just in particular locations, but during particular life stages, like particular stages in their life cycle. Different parts of masculinity are going to be more relevant. Like age really matters when you're 17. It matters a lot less when you're 30.
Yeah.
Those things are hugely pertinent. But the biggest contribution of this paper towards, I mean, there's another paper that's going to be on that question kind of in a more detailed way. The biggest contribution of this paper would be stop all counter-radicalisation projects that say that they have something to say about Indonesian radicalism. Because it's not a coherent category and it doesn't fit with the experiences of people who do that. And that framing itself totally corrupts our understanding of what radicalism is, which is actually this incredibly complicated set of attachments and commitments and effective relationships and embodied performances that are always situated in a context and always relational to other groups of people. And just trying to pluck out the radicalism part of it is a kind of dumb project that doesn't make sense.
Yep.
Is how I would understand it, yeah.
Al?
I'm probably going to ask the same question as Martin asked. I think probably. I shouldn't.
You could resist that urge.
I do love anyone that has a go at IR. Everyone knows that.
Yeah.
I guess underpinning my question is. Well, that's what I heard. No, not Martin.
Oh.
Dave.
Oh.
No, Martin wasn't. I guess the question is, I wanted to know more about Connell.
Yeah.
And this kind of setup that you did. I really loved the narrative, and I thought it was really difficult to disagree with all the relational elements. It seems just intuitively correct that as you move through, you've got different masculinities that are relational, context specific, and button agree against each other and seem perfect. But I mean, this Connell, it must be a very simplistic position that she adopts if she's your go-to target. And I couldn't really pin down. I know that she had sedimentary layers, a little bit of hierarchy, and something of the state, and I just wanted to know, what is it specifically that you're attacking?
So yeah, I'll give the context there. Connell is like the first person that substantially suggested there's more than one masculinity. Up until that point, people tended to talk about masculinity and femininity as like two things, flip sides of the coin. Raywin's work was really influential because she says there are masculinities and there are femininities, and then she has a kind of like Marxist tinged Gramscian analysis of gender as being about these constructions of consent. Her case studies originally are focused on Australia, where a context I think where the state matters a lot more and where national identity plays, in my perception of it, at least more of a role than it does in these particular people's lives. I think the question of how much the state matters is a contextual one, right? Like I think it does matter more in different spots than it does for these guys. I'm probably not presenting Connell's work in the most complicated sense. I don't think it's simplistic at all. I actually really like it. But Connell is working within a sociology which at the time is preoccupied with nationalism.
Is she an IR scholar?
Not at all. No, she's a sociologist. Yeah.
Much better than that, Al.
I mean, I would actually also say that in the masculinity side of stuff, like on the whole, not just in IR, this nationalist frame is the frame. Like there are exceptions in masculinity studies. Some of the anthropologists do differently, but they do it in really like kind of messed up, fetishizing the local ways. But
But you really like that work too, don't you?
I do, yeah.
Slate IR is also Slate the field of anthropology. Well done, Dave.
How to win friends and influence people.
They have different disciplining things on the way that they see the world, and sociology unfortunately tends to discipline around the nation.
Absolutely.
IR tends to discipline around between the nations. I mean, I just think that these are things about how you get what you see the world as being naturally like.
Yeah, because that's what I was thinking. The departure point was an IR departure point, and then draw you towards that state hierarchy type area.
Yeah. I mean, I would also note that like Connell is the person in feminist IR masculinities. There are some post-structuralist counterpoints that don't like her sort of really regimented approach, but for the most part her work is the approach.
Disappointed we're not bashing IR then.
Get over it. Nikki.
Masculinity is not involved in this one.
Yes. Let's not go there.
In everything, Richard.
Thank you, David. Fascinating. Loved it. Loved the ethnographic approach to your work. I don't know that my comments are necessarily terribly well structured, but I had, it just stimulated so many things for me. First of all, I was thinking about maybe there's some resonance with Lee Wilson's recent book on
Martial arts in the body.
Yes. The way he's also. Do you know that work?
I've organised a coffee with him to talk about it. Yeah,
Excellent,
I'm vaguely
excellent.
familiar with it, but I haven't read it. Yeah.
So
Don't
for me,
repeat those things about anthropology when you do.
Yeah, because he is an anthropologist.
Yeah.
So I thought that was good. I was also thinking about Niels Bubant's work on ontological security in Indonesia. I think there may be some things there. So as you know, I'm really interested in ontological security as a concept. I'm really interested in institutions.
Yeah.
So, and hybridity. So I think if Shahar was here, he'd be very happy to hear you talking about scale, actually, because I think but I'm interested in the way institutions come together. So my question then is, where are the institutions and the regulatory frames in your analysis? I think actually this paper could really, and I don't want to sound like if I was doing your project, this is how I would do it, but I think if maybe you thought about the material in a slightly different way, that might give you a way of thinking about, who do we interest with this paper? How do we intersect with some of the ongoing debates? Or maybe submit this one somewhere and then think about how you might reframe it again more strategically. But I say this because the language of rules, authority, discipline, respect are percolating in this paper all the way through. Notions of discipline particularly really struck me. And you talk about rules as well. So I'm wondering where are they, and they're shifting in different contexts. So where are the rules coming from? Who are the authorities? Clearly rules are still present. Yeah. You're rejecting the nation-state model, fine by me, I'm happy with that. But clearly there's sites of authority establishing what is rightful, because you also talked about rightful or the good man, who's establishing these notions of the good man. So I just wonder if there's something in the kind of conceptual approach to the work that if you if you sort of took a step back from that really rich empirical material, that actually might allow you to structure it in a way that you could speak to some really pertinent debates in peace and conflict studies about, ontologies of security as well as authority and discipline and rulemaking and those kind of things.
Yeah, thanks. That's really helpful. I mean, I think I don't know how I would fit in this paper. This paper's already too long. I need to cut the stuff out of it. The rule stuff's so important, right? Because you have to understand how the theological worldview of these guys works.
Yeah.
Their understanding of Islam is that the world is ruled by scientific rules. Like, this is how the world functions. There are scientific rules that structure Earth that are set by Allah, and you need to follow them, and things will go well. And so one of the biggest debates between these Islamist groups is who has the right understanding of the rules. And they have these amazingly powerful organisational structures to convince people about it. So one of the young guys who I hung out with a lot, he trained people in pesanthrans, like the Islamic boarding schools. And that's one of the big sites where they do it, because this is a way that poor kids can get an education and gain status, is to go to a pesantran and get trained up. And then he, shows them a bunch of videos of people in the Balkans getting killed by Christians, and then shows them the proper rules to respond to that. So I think there's a whole ontology about what rules are and how rules guide the universe in a fundamental way that is complicated theologically, and I haven't really worked out how to talk about it.
But even your actor is a rule maker in a sense, isn't he?
He
because
is,
he's saying, my sons can go and fight, but so I think there's something in there about authority and rulemaking and the kind of security one derives from that as a person in these contexts, as a gendered person in these contexts. That might be really
that rule stuff's super interesting too. He hates the Islamic State and he thinks that they're like barbarians, but he's totally okay with his kids going and dying fighting with them, because if they go and die, it's worth more than them being with the right group.
Not if they're killed by women.
That's not even in the picture. Yeah, he would hate that. Yeah.
Okay, Federica.
Thank you, David. I'm going to go in the opposite direction completely from what Nikki just said now. So instead of thinking of order and authority and rules, what popped to mind was just before queer assemblage and how she takes over the notion of intersectionality that you were more or less implicitly talking about, right? So you kind of, so the way that I understand your project is that you are trying to expand the construction of an analysis of gender beyond the domestic and the nation, the domain of the nation, especially the notion of militarized masculinity. So one, and you did it in a way that was very harsh on feminist IR. And I'm in a way to define that kind of field. Sorry, like there is a lot of work that is already transnationalizing militarized masculinity. I mean, Amanda Chisholm working on Gurkhas, for instance, right? Or many others, especially those working on, or Melanie Richemont-Petit, who's working on terrorism in the war on terror. So they are all like that effort. Like I appreciate what you're doing, but I think like you've been very, very harsh on the existing literature. And then you talk a lot about mobility, transnationalism, multiple articulations, and the intersectionality of gender. Sorry, my chair is like squeaking. And the intersectionality of race, nationalism, social status, class, like all these things. But you didn't really mention sexuality. So I'm wondering if that plays a role. And if you went down the path, would you have landed in Just Being Poor work more? Like, I mean, does Just Being Poor work? Like, does she do anything in your work, or is she? Because she really works on transnationalism and the transnationalization of gender identities. And it seems to me that you're really talking about where she talks about shifting identities in space, time, corporeal positions, and the rearrangements of identities. So
thanks for the feedback. Yeah, there's a couple of things there. I don't really use her stuff. That's a kind of intentional theoretical framing in the way that I take a more structuralist approach to how materialities structure this stuff than that whole body of work. I mean, the transnationalism question is also one. Maybe I can articulate better. I think that's also a problem because it frames transnationalism as this exceptional moment. Like, look at these people who are transnationalized and they have this different gender positionality from it. I don't think transnationalism escapes the nation. It just puts a prefix on it. That's not to say it's not useful, but it's just, I don't think that goes where I want with it. The other stuff about those things, I've got another paper that I'm working on for IFJP conference next year, which is on cathexis, like attachment and bodily attachment for these people, about what things that they attach to during their lives, and sexuality is going to come into that in a pretty big way. There's a methodological limitation with it, though. These guys are not comfortable talking to you about sexuality, and there's some really ethical questions about whether I, as a Western academic, should go into a community of men and try and extract the personal, like the very intense private aspects of their life, because another man having an interest in their sex life has pretty intense implications for how they, like, that can be understood as a really intense insult, like you wanting to talk about their sense of attachment and sexuality. Talking about their wife at all is not generally cool. They're happy to talk about women in general, particularly when they're saying how bad they are, but they're not particularly happy to talk about any particular relationship they've had with women. There was one exception with that, which is this guy who was in the Pasantrans, that he was in a Sharia police group, go beat people up for being on dates and drinking alcohol. He also had a girlfriend the whole time. The girlfriend was another guy in the Pasantran that he was in. And that guy told the senior cleric that he was in this relationship. So then him and his friends beat that guy up for insulting his honour. So there's some complex things going on there, but it's the prohibition on talking about sexuality is so intense that I didn't get a lot on it, unfortunately. I would have loved to, but...
The absence of that could be also a way of talking about it.
Yeah, and I think that homoerotics are doing a lot of things here, but not in an explicit way. Like their physical attachment. They talk about wanting to be like these people, and they talk about them really physically. They want the beard. They want the white cloth. They want to be physically athletic. They want to be able to do martial arts. There is an intense allure of these people, but constantly with the protection of it, like kind of like the frat boy screaming no homo, you know, like it's the most homoerotic moment in the way that they talk about each other physically, but then are so uncomfortable with the implications of that. So I haven't fully worked out my thinking on that, but I think it is an avenue I need to do better on. Yeah.
Maybe you can think about homosociality.
Yeah, absolutely.
Eloise.
Thank you. Thanks, David. That was really, really interesting, and I'm trying to get my head around it. Got a couple of comments and one question. One is, so Ali's experience is one experience.
Yeah.
There might be multiple experiences within that community. For instance, I'm just thinking of veterans who come back, you know, conscientious objectors. So I'm wondering whether, you know, you're framing it as if Ali's experience is one that we should buy of all men in that context. So a clarification of that on that one. I'm also thinking of the Gurkhas. You know, their motto is better to die than to live a coward, right? Yeah. Now we know historically where that comes from, and it's linked to political economy and so on and so forth. So there is a similarity here that we can see, and that's also a transnational project. But my question really is, so what you're saying is we cannot account for Ali's experience by taking a state-centered perspective simply because he's born in Indonesia, because he has his life experience is connected through these multiple networks and relations and so on and so forth. Now, that's fair enough, but I think Nikki also has a point when she talked about institutions. Not taking a state-centered or methodological nationalist approach is different to accounting for an institution that still shapes and frames your experiences. So there are two different things at play here. And the question I have is, so from critical IR or critical development studies, the issue of scale has been down for a long, long time, whether we're talking about even Cynthia Enlow's work on, you know, why the mundane matters, right, where she links the maids, right, to diplomacy. Or, so the whole lived experiences of connected lived lives is part of a debate already. So what do you think is unique about the contribution? I think it's great. So I'm just pushing to say, you know, how would you talk to those that's already there through, you know, that's critique methodological nationalism, but by inserting this specific example, what makes the military aspect of this and the jihadi case unique compared to, say, a political economy of global relations?
Yeah, I mean, to the first point, no, I'm not saying that his experience is generalisable, and it's totally different experience to other men that we spoke to. We had a small sample, right? We did 9 life histories. These are really they take a long time to do. You've got to do multiple hour interviews. But even within those 9, there was massive differences. So what I'm not trying to say that his experience is generalisable, but I'm actually not trying to reject that the national framing gives you something. What I'm saying is if you take a national framing, it gives you one story, and if you take a different framing, it gives you a different story. You take another framing, it gives you a different story, and they're all actually like true stories that tell you different things. And that it's not that you shouldn't take a national approach. It's that you should intentionally choose which framing you're using. And
for what purpose? Because I would, and I take a non-state-centered perspective, but I still have to account for the multiple sites of power and authority, right? Account for that.
I don't think that those are different. I think those are different things. I think that you can account for the role of the state and not take a methodological nationalist perspective entirely. I think that there's lots of different ways that the state plays in his life. That, you know, his imprisonment, his resistance to Jakartan elites, his experience with the Soviets, the state's all through his life, whether you take a methodological nationalist perspective or not. What I think really matters is when you think of this guy, do you think of him as being an Indonesian jihadi? Or the one that I really worry about is, do you think of him as a foreign fighter? Because he's Indonesian then goes to Afghanistan, whereas he's pretty similarly foreign when he's in Ambon. Actually, this question of foreign fighters as a discourse, and particularly around jihadis, really, I think, smuggles some not helpful assumptions about what a foreign fighter is compared to other fighters. Their foreignness in particular.
Frank.
It was a great talk. I really enjoyed it, even though I'm not in this field. So my question is also going to be very simplistic. But it's about sort of what the project is about, and having heard all the other questions about, is it really about methodological nationalism? My question was, is that so because it's a stepping stone towards bringing in culture, Islam, as a kind of factor? If that's the case, then perhaps this would be an interesting project into group dynamics and the more generic nature of group dynamics and how you can encounter that in other contexts where Islam is not a factor. So I was in my mind sort of thinking of a comparative project, and I'm thinking of Satudara in the Netherlands, which is a bikie gang, a hardcore bikie gang of Moluccans who have the same cause. It's the colonial oppressive, the country that hasn't delivered on the promise of returning their ancestors back to to the Moluccan Islands. So they've had an episode of hijacking of trains that didn't end well. Now they've gone underground, and they're one of the most feared bikie gangs in the Netherlands. So there's recently a documentary that appeared in the Netherlands about the ruthlessness, the killings, the drug trafficking, incredibly, they're up there with the Bandidos and the Hells Angels. So to cut a long story short, I was thinking about that as a kind of comparative study of the same group dynamics where all the factors are present except Islam. And that could be a really interesting, of course, in a dream where everything is possible. That to me was an incredibly powerful comparative study that you could be doing, where you say, well, pretty much all the other factors are there except Islam. So that tells you something about group dynamics more generically.
That's interesting. I have to think about the group dynamic stuff. It hasn't been a main frame for what I've been doing. I think for the overall project, I mean, this is like a small offshoot, right? The overall project is, how do you get men to disengage from those networks? And the point of this paper is that we found thinking about them as primarily Indonesian wasn't helpful in that. And the ways that they disengaged were not primarily about their Indonesianness or their radicalness. It was about all these other effective relationships of attachment and intimacy that played out.
Okay, we have one more question.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. I really liked it. My question is in the context of poverty and inequality. So the class in which one is born, to what extent does this dimension matters in terms of choice? Like, for example, you mentioned about Ali's statement about his son dying in war. So I'm just thinking about the class in which one is born, and if someone who is really rich and influential would be able to say it in those terms. So just to
yeah, thanks. The class matters a huge amount, but it matters differently depending on who you are. So one of the other participants that we worked with, who was really involved in the Bali bombings, he's a Pakistani background guy who grew up in Bali. He's from a rich family and he's got a good education. In his context, he felt like his life was lacking something because he was Pakistani in this Balinese majority area, he's a religious minority. He goes to university, the Muhammadiyah University, and rocks up with a bunch of other Muslims who say, hey mate, come on, let's be a part of a community. And suddenly he's involved in this Islamist group. Next minute he's facilitating the Bali bombings. Whereas for the Betawi guys, the class was important in a different way, that they were poor and they were racialized and those things were together, like they were the same. You can be a poor Javanese guy who speaks really greatly publicly and has great poetry skills and get a ton of status. If you're a poor Betawi guy, you're a thug. The class implications have different statuses based on where you are and your ethnic positioning and age too, and these kind of things. So class really mattered, but it was filtered through other things. And I think one of the things I've been trying to do in this project is, and which I find mentally really hard, is resisting purely materialist or purely discursive explanations of any of these things. I mean, I think there's a real tendency to either go purely discursive or purely material. I don't think it's helpful. And also to try and resist thinking about race, gender, class, sexuality, location, age, these things as being separate categories, and actually thinking about how they integrate to make a particular gender positionality. I'm not really mentally onto that yet, but that is part of what I'm trying to do unsuccessfully in this project.
Okay, Ryan, next.
Thank you so much, David. I'll ask because you alluded to it in your intro and no one else has picked up on it. What was the process of gaining the trust of these people and interviewing them? Was it a drawn out process? How many cigarettes did you have to sit on stoop, smoking?
You've got lung cancer now.
I was just intrigued when you asked that. Did you take up smoking to actually?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I did. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because what do these guys do when they're not? They don't drink. They don't fraternize with women. They don't gamble. They don't like music's pretty suspect too. What else have you got? You drink tea. You drink tea and coffee, and you smoke clove cigarettes. Unfiltered clove cigarettes. They're horrible. Yeah. No, so getting to know them. This work is with Nakhud Ismail, and he went to one of Abu Bashir's pasantrans when he was younger. And he got kicked out while he was part of their foreign fighter program. He got kicked out because he was dating one of the principal's daughters, which you're not allowed to do. He then went and became an exec and then became a reporter, and he was reporting on the Bali bombings when he found out that his roommate was one of the main Bali bombers in high school. He is then friends with all these people, just like socially, and he set this NGO up to help them disengage from the network, and he's mates with them. And if he's not mates with them, he's mates with a mate, So that's how the connection was. And because of him vouching and him knowing them, I got a pretty easy in, to be honest. It wouldn't be possible for me to do this research alone. I couldn't do these interviews solo. Like, even now, then knowing that, I couldn't do these interviews solo. But there was a ton of hanging out. I mean, this is just my experience of Indonesian culture and these guys. They have a really loose understanding of time, like when to turn up and how long any event is going to go for. So very often these like interviews, which we're doing 2 to 3 hour interviews per person to get their whole life story. And around that, there's like 5 to 6 hours of eating, smoking cigarettes, complaining about Donald Trump, like just a lot of hanging out.
Like an Australian university, then, really.
Similar, yeah.
Martin, you had a...
Yeah, I wasn't happy with your answer to the race and gender question, because that's a cop-out, right? I mean, you could add identity into that as well, but all of them are somehow related, and you can't disentangle them from one another. And then this becomes a kind of really problematic monism. But set that aside. I'm really interested in, you used the word again just now, positionality.
Yeah.
I want to understand what the difference is between a position and a positionality, and between relations and relationality. And I wonder really why this is so important.
That's because it doesn't like decoloniality.
I don't like any alities. I think alities are cop-outs. But no, I just reality. So much loss for it, right?
I tend to use...
Would you like to use the last 5 minutes to put him back?
I like the alities because they don't imply fixed ones. They're ones that are dynamic and relational. Positions tend to imply more of a fixed thing. So that's the basic answer.
Oh, wow. And for me,
really?
Exactly.
Right, wow.
Precisely.
Okay.
All right, well, let's solve that
That's
one.
interesting.
What do we do with those 4 minutes now?
Do we have any more questions?
I'll
Yeah, come on in. Jump in.
So I was just thinking, when you talked about Ali ending up destitute, it made me wonder what the kind of organisational relationships are in the way that these, I want to say, looked after by the organisation, and how that shifts, because I was thinking it's pretty poor. Those organisations should be run. It's the welfare.
Yeah, you can't support a guy who's gone to jail.
What do you mean you can't support a guy who's gone to jail? I mean, they're a legal organisation, so what does that mean?
Because if you give him money, it's easy to link you. There are exceptions to this, right? So people who have status...
I think the IRA were all over that. I mean, they kind of worked out ways to do this.
The Indonesian context is a little different, particularly after the Bali bombings and then the Jakarta attacks. The Indonesian military is pretty keen on just killing people, and has a very loose interpretation of formal legal processes. So some of these guys that have more status in the community on the whole are able to be supported by extended networks, particularly the Javanese guys who are well educated. The Betawi guys and the Sundanese and the Balinese, not really. It's a huge issue when they go to jail. This is actually how the NGO I work with gets to them. When they go to jail, their wives get nothing. And in jail, the guys have to support themselves financially through illegal dealings. So the network supports the guys that have more status in jail themselves. But their wives and kids get nothing. They become completely impoverished. So the NGO that I'm working with there gives jobs to their wives and tries to integrate them into the community.
This makes a lot of sense. So how do you get it in terms of the political economy we're talking about?
If you're a higher status guy, the network will find a way to support you indirectly that can't be tied. But for the majority, particularly the guys who are racialized or come from like marginal areas in Indonesia, they get treated really badly.
Right, so they get no support, financial support, but what about the kind of, again, sort of the rules and institutions? Is there still some sort of relationship that exists with their organisation, whatever that is?
Yeah, in prison, when they're in prison, their network is the people in prison. And the prisons are often like a pretty loosely imprisoned system where there's a lot of stuff going in and out of the prison. There's massive economies in the prisons and quite a bit of violence in the prisons that's organised by these network guys. So they have a whole trading deal, so Rambo, who I was talking about before, is great mates with his prisoners from when he was in jail, and he had this whole protection racket that he ran in prison. And so he could give you money to certain people, not because of his ethnic and class status, but just because he is a super violent guy who is not afraid to like rough up people. So there's whole economies going on there. The NGO that I work with gives guys jobs after they get out of prison, but only jobs where they're forced to interact with people from different religious and ethnic backgrounds. So you'll be given a job as a driver if you're driving Christian Chinese, and that's part of their model. It's like you get money if you are willing to deal with all these infidels.
Okay, on that note, join with me in thanking David for...
And if anyone's got suggestions about where to submit this monstrosity, I would really appreciate that.
So the International Feminist Journal of Politics.